Ash Waverly was the richest rancher in Texas until a business betrayal and a deadly accident destroyed everything. His fiancée left him. His friends abandoned him. His own family turned their backs. Now he lives alone in a mansion that feels like a tomb, surrounded by empty fields and bitter memories. Then one stormy night, a beat-up truck breaks down on his property. Inside is Evie Morales, 8 months pregnant and on the run from a dangerous past. She needs shelter for just a few days. Cash reluctantly lets her stay in the old barn. What starts as simple charity becomes something neither expected. Evie's stubborn warmth begins to melt Cash's frozen heart. Her unborn child becomes the hope he never knew he needed. But when both their pasts come hunting for them, Cash must choose between the safety of isolation and fighting for the family he never thought he deserved. What happens when love finds you at your lowest point? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in the foyer still chimed every hour, but Cash Waverly had stopped listening months ago. He sat in his leather chair, the same one where his daddy had taught him to read cattle futures and oil reports, staring at the empty picture frame on the mahogany side table. The silver frame had once held a photograph of him and Victoria on their engagement day, both of them grinning like fools in front of the old oak tree by the creek. Now it held nothing but dust and the ghost of better times. Outside, the November. Wind rattled the windows of the mansion that had been in his family for 3 generations, 22 rooms, each one echoing with memories that felt more like accusations these days. His grandfather's silver pocket watch sat heavy in his palm, its familiar weight a reminder of time slipping away and legacies crumbling to dust. Cash had built an empire on this land. Waverly Oil and Cattle had stretched across 4 counties, employing half the folks in 3 towns. He'd been the golden boy who could do no wrong, the man other ranchers came to for advice, the fellow who always had the right word at church socials and the deepest pockets when the community needed help. Politicians had courted his endorsement. Business magazines had featured him on their covers. Hell, he'd even been invited to the governor's mansion for Christmas dinner 2 years running. Then came Marcus. Marcus Delacroix had been his business partner for 15 years, the smooth-talking Louisiana boy who'd married Cash's cousin and become family. Marcus handled the financial side while Cash worked the land and the cattle. They'd trusted each other with everything: bank accounts, business decisions, even their wives' secrets over Sunday dinners. The betrayal had been surgical in its precision. Marcus had slowly siphoned money from their joint accounts, used Cash's signature stamp to authorize loans against properties Cash didn't even know were leveraged, and forged documents that made Cash appear to be skimming from employee pension funds. When the FBI came knocking, they found Cash's name on every fraudulent document and Marcus's alibis airtight. But the financial ruin was just the beginning. The ranch accident had happened 3 weeks after the federal investigation began. 2 good men, Billy Rodriguez and Tom Whitaker, had died when a cattle trailer jackknifed on the county road. The investigation revealed faulty brakes that should have been replaced months earlier. Brakes that Marcus, as the company's chief financial officer, had signed off on postponing for budget considerations. Cash had never seen those budget reports. He'd trusted Marcus to handle the operational expenses while he focused on the cattle and the drilling operations, but the paperwork showed Cash's forged signature approving the delay, and the families of the dead men had every right to their anger. The lawsuits came like vultures after a storm. Wrongful death, negligent homicide, financial fraud. The federal prosecutors offered plea deals that would have sent him to prison for 12 years. His lawyers, the expensive ones from Dallas, had advised him to take the deal rather than risk a trial that could mean life behind bars. But Cash was innocent and stubborn and proud. He'd refused the plea, spent his remaining money on legal fees, and watched his reputation burn while Marcus disappeared into witness protection with a new identity and a federal pension. Victoria had lasted longer than most. She'd stood by him through the first investigation, held his hand during the preliminary hearings, and even planned to postpone their wedding until things settled down. But when the criminal charges were filed and the civil suits began piling up, she'd finally seen the writing on the wall. The engagement ring had come back to him in a manila envelope with a note that said simply, "I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore." His brother James had been the final nail in the coffin. James, who'd borrowed money from Cash to start his own ranch, who'd brought his kids to Uncle Cash's house every Christmas, who'd been the best man at Cash's almost wedding. James had testified for the prosecution, claiming Cash had always been reckless with other people's money and had a gambling problem that James had covered up for years. None of it was true, but truth seemed to matter less than headlines these days. Now Cash spent his days walking the empty hallways of a house too big for one broken man. The staff had been let go months ago when the bank accounts ran dry. The cattle had been sold to pay legal fees. The oil wells had been seized by creditors. All that remained was the main house and the 1,000 acres immediately surrounding it, protected by a family trust his great-grandfather had established back when Texas was still figuring out how to be a state. He poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, the cheap stuff now, since the good whiskey had been among the first casualties of his fall, and settled back into his father's chair. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his palm, counting down the seconds of a life that had lost all meaning. Tomorrow would bring another day of silence, another day of watching the dust settle on furniture that had once hosted governors and oil barons. Another day of being the man who'd lost everything because he'd trusted the wrong person. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of another empty day in Cash Waverly's fallen kingdom. The wedding ring sat in the top drawer of his bedroom dresser, still nestled in its original blue velvet box. Cash hadn't opened that drawer in 4 months, but he knew it was there. A 2-carat diamond solitaire that had cost him more than most folks made in a year. He'd bought it at Tiffany's in Dallas, flying Victoria up in his private helicopter just to pick out the perfect stone. She'd cried when he proposed, said yes before he'd even finished asking the question. That helicopter was gone now, sold to pay the lawyers who'd ultimately failed him anyway. Cash stood at his bedroom window, looking out over land that had been in his family since 1887. His great-grandfather had come to Texas with nothing but determination and a head for business, building the first oil derrick with borrowed money and borrowed hope. Each generation had added to the legacy, more land, more wells, more cattle, more influence. By the time Cash inherited it all at 25, the Waverly name carried weight from Austin to Houston. He'd been so damn proud back then. Proud of the legacy, proud of his success, proud of the woman who'd agreed to marry him. Victoria Harrington came from Dallas money. Old money, the kind that traced back to cotton plantations and railroad fortunes. Her daddy owned 3 banks and had oil interests throughout East Texas. It had been a perfect match, or so everyone said. 2 powerful families joining forces, combining resources and influence. They'd met at a charity auction for children's hospitals. Victoria had been bidding on a week at a resort in Cowboy, and Cash had outbid her just to get her attention. She'd been furious at first, elegant in her anger, with her blonde hair swept up and her green eyes flashing. But when he'd offered to share the vacation with her, she'd laughed despite herself. 3 months later, they were inseparable. Victoria had loved the ranch in those early days. She'd learned to ride horses, helped him plan the renovation of the main house, even got her hands dirty during cattle roundups. She talked about filling the empty bedrooms with children, about hosting family gatherings that would echo through the halls for generations. She'd wanted 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls, and had already picked out names for each one. But as Cash's legal troubles deepened, Victoria's visits became shorter and less frequent. She'd started mentioning her father's concerns about the situation, suggesting that maybe Cash should consider settling out of court. When the criminal charges were filed, she'd stopped staying overnight, claiming she needed to think things through. The final break had come during the worst week of Cash's life. Tom Whitaker's widow had confronted him outside the courthouse, her 3 young children clinging to her black dress as she screamed accusations about how his negligence had made them orphans. The local news had captured every moment, broadcasting Sarah Whitaker's grief and rage to the entire state of Texas. That night, Victoria had called instead of visiting. Her voice had been calm and measured, the way she sounded when she was delivering bad news to the bank's loan applicants. "Cash, I love you, but I can't watch you destroy yourself like this. And I can't let you destroy me too," he'd tried to explain. Again, to make her understand that he was innocent, that Marcus had manipulated everything. But Victoria had heard it all before, and her patience had finally run out. "Maybe you didn't intend for those men to die, but you signed those papers. Cash, you put your name on documents without reading them. That's not the man I fell in love with. That man would never have been so careless with other people's lives." The ring had come back 3 days later, along with all the letters he'd written her during their courtship. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a clean break from a woman who'd learned to cut her losses before they became too painful to bear. His brother James had lasted longer, but the betrayal had cut deeper. James had testified that Cash had always been reckless with money, claiming their father had worried about Cash's judgment even before the old man died. James had painted a picture of a spoiled heir who'd inherited more than he could handle, who'd trusted the wrong people because he'd never learned to be careful. The worst part was that some of it might have been true. Cash had trusted Marcus completely, had given him access to everything without oversight. He'd signed papers without reading every line, delegated financial decisions because he'd preferred working with cattle and oil crews. In his arrogance, he'd believed his success made him invulnerable. Now the legal bills continued to pile up on his kitchen table, and the civil suits dragged on with no end in sight. His remaining assets were frozen pending the outcome of multiple investigations. The IRS had seized his bank accounts, his credit cards had been cancelled. He lived on cash from the sale of his personal effects, watches, artwork, furniture that had been in the family for generations. The town that had once celebrated him now whispered behind his back. Former friends crossed the street to avoid conversation. Church members who'd once sought his counsel now prayed for his victims instead. Even his longtime ranch foreman, Miguel Santos, had found work elsewhere when Cash could no longer afford to pay him. Cash pulled the wedding ring from its velvet box and held it up to the morning light. The diamond caught the sun and threw tiny rainbows across the ceiling, beautiful and empty as a promise broken. He'd planned to give Victoria everything: his name, his legacy, his love. Instead, he'd given her nothing but reasons to leave. He placed the ring back in its box and closed the drawer. Some ghosts were better left undisturbed. The family Bible still sat on the kitchen table where his grandmother had placed it 60 years ago, its leather cover cracked and faded from decades of daily readings. Cash couldn't remember the last time he'd opened it. The gold-embossed letters spelling Holy Bible had worn thin from his grandmother's fingers, tracing them during her morning prayers, but now they seemed to mock him from across the empty room. His daily routine had become a monument to meaninglessness. Coffee at 6, black and bitter because he'd forgotten to buy cream again. Toast if he remembered to eat, though most mornings he forgot until his stomach cramped around noon. He'd walk the property line, checking fence posts that didn't need, counting cattle that were no longer there. The silence followed him everywhere. No ranch hands calling out morning greetings, no cattle lowing in the pastures, no oil pumps rhythmically pulling black gold from the earth. The worst part was Sunday mornings. For 47 years, Cash had attended Cedar Creek Baptist Church with his family. His grandmother had carried him there as a baby. His parents had made sure he never missed a service growing up. and he'd continued the tradition as an adult. He'd served on the church board, funded the new Sunday school building, and never missed, putting a generous check in the collection plate. Now he couldn't bring himself to walk through those doors. The first Sunday after the arrest, he'd tried. He'd put on his best suit, driven the 10 miles to town, and sat in his truck in the church parking lot for 20 minutes. Through the windows, he could see the congregation he'd known his entire life, the Hendersons and the Martinez. Old. Mrs. Crawford, who taught his Sunday school class. Young families whose children he'd watched grow up. But when he'd reached for the door handle, he'd heard the whispered conversations from the week before, the speculation about his guilt, the pity in voices that had once held respect. He'd driven home instead, and he'd been driving home every Sunday since. The isolation was eating him alive from the inside out. He'd been a social man his entire life, the kind who knew everyone's name at the county fair and remembered to ask about sick relatives and new grandchildren. He'd hosted poker games with neighboring ranchers, attended every community event, and opened his home for fundraisers and political gatherings. The silence of his own company was a punishment worse than any prison cell. His drinking had gotten worse over the past month. It started with a beer at lunch, progressed to whiskey with dinner, and now he was opening the bottle before noon most days. The alcohol didn't make the pain go away, but it made the edges softer, made the empty rooms feel less like a mausoleum. His grandfather's pocket watch reminded him that each day was passing, but the whiskey helped him care less about where time was taking him. The ranch hands who'd worked for him for decades had been the hardest goodbye. Miguel Santos had been his foreman for 15 years, a steady man with 3 kids and a wife who made the best tamales in 3 counties. Miguel had tried to stay on without pay, insisting that the ranch was his responsibility too. But Cash couldn't let a good man sacrifice his family's security for loyalty to a lost cause. "Senor Cash," Miguel had said on his last day, his weathered hands turning his hat brim round and round, "you are a good man. The truth, it will come out. You will see." But Miguel's faith couldn't pay his mortgage or feed his children, so he'd taken a job with the Morrison Ranch 20 miles north. The other hands had scattered to neighboring spreads, carrying their skills and their stories to employers who could actually pay them. Cash missed their voices, missed the easy camaraderie of men who worked hard and understood the rhythm of ranch life. The house itself had become his prison. 22 rooms that had once buzzed with activity now stood empty and accusing. The dining room where he'd entertained oil executives and politicians now gathered dust. The den where his father had taught him to read financial reports was dark and cold. The master bedroom felt too big for one man's regrets. He'd started sleeping in his father's old office instead, curled up on the leather sofa with a blanket his mother had crocheted. It was the smallest room in the house, and somehow the size made the loneliness more bearable. The walls were lined with books his father had collected, treatises on animal husbandry, oil exploration, and Texas history. Sometimes Cash would pull down a volume and read until his eyes grew heavy, letting his father's marginalia remind him of conversations they'd shared about building something lasting. But even his father's wisdom felt hollow now. What was the point of building a legacy if it could all disappear because of one man's betrayal? What good were principles and hard work if the law couldn't tell the difference between an honest man and a criminal? The family Bible seemed to watch him from across the kitchen table, its presence both comforting and condemning. His grandmother had found strength in those pages. His parents had drawn wisdom from the Psalms and the Proverbs. But Cash couldn't bring himself to open it, couldn't face the possibility that even God had given up on him. The truth was, he'd given up on himself. Each morning brought the same routine of checking for mail that only contained legal threats, walking fences that protected nothing valuable, and counting the hours until he could drink himself to sleep again. The pocket watch in his hands measured time, but time no longer seemed to be moving toward anything worth reaching. He was becoming a ghost in his own life, haunting the rooms where he'd once been happy, waiting for an ending he couldn't envision, but couldn't avoid. The storm had been building all day, turning the November sky the color of old pewter and sending the mesquite trees into a frenzied dance. Cash stood on his front porch, whiskey glass in hand, watching the wall of rain sweep across the distant hills like God's own curtain falling on another empty day. The weather service had been talking about this system for a week, a massive front pushing down from Oklahoma, bringing golf ball-sized hail and the kind of wind that could strip the roof off a barn. He should have been worried about the house, about the old oak trees that leaned too close to the power lines, about the cattle gates that might blow open if the wind caught them right. But worry required caring about the future, and Cash had been living 1 hour at a time for so long that tomorrow felt like a foreign concept. The first fat raindrops hit the dust of his circular drive like bullets, each one sending up a tiny puff of parched earth. Texas had been dry all summer, and the ground was too hard to absorb much water. Most of this storm would run off into the creek beds and arroyos, turning them into temporary rivers that would flood the low-water crossings and strand anyone foolish enough to be driving in weather like this. Lightning split the sky with a crack that seemed to shake the windows, followed by thunder that rolled across the hills like a freight train. Cash took another sip of whiskey and settled into his father's old rocking chair to watch the show. There was something fitting about watching the sky tear itself apart when your own life had done much the same thing. That's when he saw the headlights. They appeared as two weak beams struggling through the curtain of rain, weaving back and forth along his private road like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. Cash squinted through the downpour, trying to make out what kind of fool would be driving in this weather. The vehicle was moving too slowly to be someone passing through, and besides, his road dead-ended at the house. Whoever this was, they were coming to see him. The truck, and he could see now that it was an old pickup, maybe 20 years old and showing every mile, lurched to a stop about 50 yards from his front porch. Steam rose from under the hood, visible even through the rain. The headlights flickered once and died, leaving the vehicle as a dark silhouette against the storm. For a long moment, nothing happened. Cash found himself leaning forward in his chair, curiosity cutting through the whiskey haze for the first time in weeks. The truck door finally opened, and a figure emerged into the storm. Even through the rain, he could see it was a woman, and, even from this distance, he could tell she was pregnant, very pregnant. She stood beside her truck for a moment, one hand on the door handle, and the other pressed protectively over her swollen belly. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, and her clothes, jeans and what looked like a man's flannel shirt, were already soaked through. She looked around like she was trying to get her bearings, then started walking toward his porch with the determined stride of someone who'd made up her mind about something. Cash set down his whiskey glass and stood up, his own protective instincts stirring despite himself. Whatever had brought this woman to his door in the middle of a storm, she needed help. He could see her more clearly now as she approached. Hispanic, maybe mid-20s, with a worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and a suitcase in her free hand. The suitcase looked like it had seen better decades, held together with duct tape and determination. She climbed the porch steps with careful precision, favoring her right leg slightly, and stopped just outside the circle of light from his porch. Lamp. Up close, he could see that she was beautiful in a fierce, uncompromising way. Her dark eyes held a wariness that spoke of hard experience, and there was something in the set of her jaw that suggested she wasn't in the habit of asking for help. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that might have been Mexican or might have been something else entirely. "My truck broke down. I was wondering if I could use your phone to call for help." Cash glanced past her at the truck, which was definitely not going anywhere tonight. Steam continued to rise from under the hood, and one of the tires looked dangerously low. Even if he had a mechanic's number to give her, which he didn't since his own vehicle sat unused in the garage, no one would come out in this weather. Phone lines are probably down, he said, which was likely true, and nobody's going to come out in this storm anyway. She nodded like she'd expected as much, but he could see the disappointment in her eyes. She shifted the suitcase to her other hand, and he noticed she was shivering despite the November heat that lingered even in the storm. "Well," she said, straightening her shoulders, "thank you anyway." She turned to go, and Cash found himself speaking before he'd really thought about it. "Wait." The woman turned back to face him, rain dripping from her hair and hope flickering in her dark eyes. Cash found himself studying her face more carefully in the porch light, the determined set of her jaw, the way she held herself despite being cold and soaked, the protective way her hand never left her belly. There was something about her that reminded him of a wild animal backed into a corner, ready to fight or flee, depending on what happened next. "You can't drive anywhere tonight," he said, stating the obvious. "Roads will be flooded by morning, and your truck's not going anywhere with that radiator." She glanced back at her vehicle, then at him, clearly weighing her options. "I don't want to impose. If you could just let me wait on your porch until the storm passes." "Don't be foolish," Cash interrupted, surprising himself with the sharpness in his voice. "You're pregnant and soaked to the bone. This storm's going to last all night." He paused, then added more gently, "There's an apartment above the old barn. It's got heat and running water. You can stay there until you figure out what to do about your truck." The wariness in her eyes deepened. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity, it's common sense." Cash stepped back and gestured toward his front door. "Come inside first. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." She hesitated for a long moment, her free hand moving to something at her throat, a small wooden cross on a thin chain that had slipped outside her shirt. Her fingers closed around it like she was saying a prayer, or maybe asking for guidance. "My name's Evie," she said finally. "Evie Morales. Cash, Waverly." He held the door open wider. "This is my property, and right now you need shelter more. Then I need privacy." Evie studied his face for another moment, then nodded and stepped through the doorway. She moved carefully, like someone who'd learned to be cautious about accepting help from strangers. Her worn boots squeaked against the hardwood floor of his foyer, and she clutched her suitcase like it contained everything she owned in the world, which, Cash realized, it probably did. "Jesus," she whispered, looking around at the grand staircase and crystal chandelier. "This place is like a museum." Cash followed her gaze, seeing his home through a stranger's eyes. The oil paintings of long-dead Waverlys staring down from the walls, the antique furniture his mother had collected over decades, the Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars. It all felt excessive and empty now, like a monument to money that no longer existed. "Used to be livelier," he said simply. "Bathroom's down that hall if you want to clean up. I'll find you some dry clothes." "I have clothes," Evie said, lifting her suitcase slightly. "Dry clothes," Cash clarified. "And something to eat. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, and for a moment her careful composure slipped. "I'm fine," but the way she said it told him she wasn't fine at all. Cash had spent enough time around pregnant cattle to recognize the signs. The slight pallor beneath her olive skin, the way she favored one side when she walked, the protective stance that suggested she was running on instinct and determination, rather than proper rest and nutrition. "Kitchen's through there," he said, pointing toward the back of the house. "I'll put some coffee on and see what I can find for dinner." "You don't have to." "Look," Cash said, his patience wearing thin despite himself. "You can argue with me all night about what I do or don't have to do, or you can accept that sometimes people help each other because it's the right thing to do. Your choice." Evie's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, or might have been recognition. She adjusted her grip on her suitcase and lifted her chin. "I won't be any trouble," she said quietly. "And I'll pay you back for whatever this costs." "We'll figure that out later," Cash said. "Right now, let's just focus on getting you warm and fed." As if to punctuate his words, thunder crashed overhead and the lights flickered. Evie instinctively moved closer to the wall, her hand going to her belly again. In that moment, Cash saw, past her fierce independence, to the frightened young woman underneath, alone, pregnant, and caught in a storm with nowhere else to go. "The barn apartment has its own generator," he added gently. "You'll be safe there." Safe. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, carrying more weight than either of them wanted to acknowledge. Evie nodded slowly, and for the first time, since she'd walked up his porch steps, Cash saw her shoulders relax just a fraction. "Thank you," she said simply. Cash nodded and headed toward the kitchen, leaving her to follow at her own pace. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the old house, something had shifted. For the first time in months, Cash had someone to take care of besides himself, and despite everything that had happened to him, that still felt like something worth doing. The barn apartment hadn't been used in 3 years, not since his last ranch foreman had moved his family to town for better schools. Cash had forgotten how cozy it could feel with someone actually living in it. From his kitchen window, he could see the warm yellow light spilling from Evie's windows as she moved around the small space, settling in like a cautious bird testing a new nest. She'd been there 4 days now, and they'd developed an awkward rhythm of polite distance. Cash would leave food on her doorstep, sandwiches, leftover stew, coffee in a thermos, and she'd leave the clean dishes back on his porch with little notes written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for the soup. Very good. The coffee was perfect. I hope this isn't too much trouble." She never asked for anything, and she never complained, but Cash found himself watching for signs of need anyway. The way she moved more slowly in the mornings, the careful way she navigated the stairs to her apartment, the fact that her beat-up truck hadn't moved from where it died that first night. This morning, he'd decided to break their careful pattern. His grandmother's old recipe book sat open on the kitchen counter, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with decades of cooking accidents. He'd found the page he was looking for, her famous buttermilk biscuits and sausage gravy, the breakfast that had made Sunday mornings special when he was a boy. The handwriting was faded but still legible. "Mix gentle, don't overwork the dough. Love makes the difference." Cash hadn't cooked a real meal in months, surviving mostly on sandwiches and whatever he could heat up in the microwave. But something about having Evie on his property had stirred old instincts, the need to provide, to make sure people were properly fed and cared for. His mother had raised him to believe that feeding people was one of the fundamental duties of hospitality. The kitchen filled with the smell of baking biscuits and crackling sausage. Cash found himself humming while he worked, a habit he'd thought he'd lost along with everything else. When the gravy was thick and creamy and the biscuits were golden brown, he loaded everything onto a tray with proper plates and silverware. He knocked on Evie's door just as the sun was painting the eastern sky pink and orange. "Come in," she called, and he found her sitting at the small table by the window, a cup of tea steaming in front of her. She'd been reading a paperback novel with a cracked spine that looked like it had been read multiple times. She was wearing different clothes today, jeans and a blue sweater that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes. "Thought you might be hungry," Cash said, setting the tray down. "Real breakfast for a change." Evie looked at the feast he'd prepared. Fluffy biscuits, creamy white gravy, thick with sage sausage, scrambled eggs and fresh orange juice. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment he thought she might cry. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly. "My grandmother's recipe," Cash replied, settling into the chair across from her. "She always said a proper breakfast could fix most of what ailed a person." Evie took a tentative bite of biscuit and gravy, then closed her eyes with something that looked like reverence. "Oh my God," she whispered. "This is incredible." Cash found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. She'd be pleased to hear that. Grandmother took her cooking seriously. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunrise paint the pastures gold through the window. Cash noticed that Evie ate with the focused attention of someone who'd learned not to take good food for granted. She cleaned her plate thoroughly, sopping up the last of the gravy with her final piece of biscuit. "Where are you from?" Cash asked when she'd finished eating. The question seemed to make her tense slightly. "Here and there," she said carefully. "Nowhere special. Heading anywhere in particular?" Another pause. "West, maybe. California. I heard there's work in the orchards." Long way to travel in a truck that barely made it this far. Evie's hand went to her belly instinctively. "I'll figure something out. I always do." There was something in her voice, a determined optimism that reminded Cash of his younger self, back when he'd believed that hard work and good intentions could overcome any obstacle. It was a naive faith, but also a brave one. "Your baby," he said gently. "When's it due?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. She looked down at her hands. "First baby. I don't really know what to expect." Cash felt something shift in his chest, a protective instinct that surprised him with its intensity. 6 weeks. She was planning to drive cross-country with a newborn baby in a truck that could barely make it to the end of his driveway. "You have. Family? Someone to help when the time comes?" Evie shook her head. "Just me and the baby. We'll be fine." The simple statement carried a weight of loneliness that Cash recognized all too well. He'd been telling himself the same thing for months, that he'd be fine, that he didn't need anyone. That isolation was just another challenge to overcome. But looking at this young woman, so determined to face the world alone, he realized how hollow those words really sounded. Cash found Evie on the apartment's small porch the next evening, her fingers working methodically with pale yellow yarn. The baby blanket was taking shape in her lap, one careful stitch at a time. She glanced up when she heard his boots on the wooden steps, but didn't stop the rhythmic motion of her knitting needles. "My grandmother taught me," she said, anticipating. His question said every baby deserved something made with love. Cash settled into the old rocking chair he'd dragged up from the barn earlier that day. The apartment's porch light created a warm circle around them, while darkness gathered in the pastures beyond. It had become their evening routine, Evie knitting, while Cash pretended to read ranch magazines that were 3 months out of date. "Yellow's a safe choice," he observed. "Don't know if it's a boy or girl. Didn't want to find out." She held up the blanket to check her progress. "Seems like there should be some surprises left in the world." Cash watched her work, noting the precision of her stitches and the way her face softened when she looked at the growing blanket. "You've thought about names. For a girl? Maybe Elena, after my grandmother." Evie's voice carried a note of sadness. "For a boy? I'm not sure yet. Elena's a beautiful name. She was a beautiful woman, tough as leather but sweet as honey." Evie paused in her knitting. "She raised me after my parents died. Car accident when I was 8. It was the first real piece of personal information she'd shared, and Cash felt honored by the trust it represented. She sounds special." She was. "Worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, made sure I stayed in school. Never let me feel sorry. For myself," Evie resumed her knitting, "she would have loved this baby." The wistfulness in her voice told Cash that her grandmother was gone too, leaving Evie truly alone in the world. He understood that kind of loss, the way it hollowed you out and made everything feel temporary and fragile. "What about the father?" he asked gently. Evie's needles stopped moving. For a moment, Cash thought she wouldn't answer, that he'd pushed. Too far, too fast. Then she set the blanket aside and looked out into the darkness. He isn't a good man," she said carefully. "The kind who thinks his fists can solve problems, the kind who believes he owns people." Cash felt his jaw tighten. "He hurt you." It wasn't a question, and Evie didn't treat it like one. "For a while, until I got smart enough to leave." She touched the wooden cross at her throat. "Took me longer than it should have to realize that love isn't supposed to leave bruises." The simple statement hit Cash like a physical blow. He'd seen domestic violence before, heard the whispered stories at church socials, noticed the careful way some women covered their arms in summer heat. But sitting here with Evie, seeing the strength it had taken for her to leave, made it real, in a way that statistics never could. Does he know about the baby? He knows. Evie picked up her knitting again, but her stitches were tighter now, more controlled. That's why I'm running. He's the type who'd use a child as leverage, as a way to control me forever. Cash understood now why she'd been so wary that first night, why she watched the road like she expected pursuit, why she never fully relaxed even in moments of apparent safety. She wasn't just pregnant and broke. She was hunted. You can't keep running forever, he said quietly. Why not? It's worked so far. What happens when the baby comes? You planning to raise a child in that truck? Evie's needles stopped again. I'll figure something out. Find work somewhere. Maybe rent a little place. There are women's shelters and programs for single mothers. But Cash could hear the uncertainty beneath her brave words. She was making it up as she went along, surviving on hope and determination, with no real plan beyond staying one step ahead of danger. You know, he said slowly, that apartment doesn't have to be temporary. Evie looked at him sharply. What do you mean? I mean you could stay. Until the baby comes, at least. Maybe longer. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. He hadn't planned to make the offer, hadn't even realized he was thinking about it until the words left his mouth. But now that he'd said it, it felt right in a way that nothing had felt right for months. I can't pay you, Evie said. I didn't ask for payment. Then why? Cash considered the question, trying to put into words something he didn't fully understand himself. Because maybe we both need someone to take care of. The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season, turning the pasture grass silver and making the air sharp enough to cut. Cash stood at his kitchen window, watching Evie navigate the icy steps from her apartment with careful deliberation. She was wearing his old ranch coat. He'd left it on her porch the night before, and it dwarfed her small frame, making her look like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes. She'd been different since their conversation on the porch, less guarded, but also more thoughtful, like she was trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. Cash had lain awake most of the night thinking about his impulsive offer, wondering if he was crazy to invite more complications into his already destroyed life. But watching her now, seeing the way she paused to check the ice before each step, one protective hand on her belly, he knew he'd meant every word. He met her at the kitchen door with coffee and eggs, and they'd fallen into an easy rhythm of shared breakfast. Evie had started contributing to the meals, pulling ingredients from her meager supplies to add flavor and creativity to their simple fare. This morning she'd made salsa from canned tomatoes and peppers, transforming plain scrambled eggs into something that tasted like hope. I need to tell you something, Cash said as they finished eating, about why everyone in town treats me like a pariah. Evie set down her coffee cup and waited, her dark eyes serious but not judgmental. Cash realized she'd never asked about his situation, never pried or demanded explanations for his isolation. She'd simply accepted his help and offered her quiet presence in return. He told her everything. About Marcus and the betrayal, about the ranch accident that killed Billy Rodriguez and Tom Whitaker, about the lawsuits and criminal charges that had stripped away his reputation along with his fortune. He showed her his father's belt buckle, the one with the Waverly brand etched deep into silver that had tarnished with neglect, and explained how it had been passed down through 4 generations of men who'd built something lasting on this land. My great-grandfather wore this buckle when he drilled his first oil well in 1903, Cash said, running his thumb over the familiar grooves. My grandfather wore it when he expanded the ranch to 3,000 acres. My father wore it when he modernized the operation and made us one of the biggest cattle operations in central Texas. He paused, feeling the weight of legacy and failure in the small piece of silver. I was wearing it the day I signed the papers that gave Marcus access to everything. The day I trusted the wrong man with 4 generations of work. Evie reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was warm and calloused from hard work, and her touch was gentle but firm. "You didn't know," she said simply. "I should have known. I should have read every document, questioned every decision, been more careful with other people's lives. And money. You trusted someone you thought was family. That's not a crime. Tell that to the families of the men who died because I was too careless to check the maintenance reports." Evie squeezed his hand. "You didn't kill those men. Marcus did, with his greed and his lies. You're just the one left holding the guilt because he was smart enough to make sure your name was on the papers." Cash looked up at her, surprised by the conviction in her voice. He'd expected judgment, maybe pity, certainly the same careful distance that everyone else maintained when they heard his story. Instead, he saw understanding and something that looked like anger on his behalf. "How? Do you know I'm telling the truth?" he asked. "How do you know I'm not exactly what everyone says I am?" Evie smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since that night in the storm. Because a guilty man wouldn't have offered shelter to a pregnant stranger. Because a careless man wouldn't cook breakfast every morning or leave blankets on my porch when the weather turns cold. Because a bad man wouldn't feel this much pain about things that weren't really his fault. She stood up and began clearing the dishes, moving around his kitchen like she belonged there. "Besides," she added, glancing back at him, "I've lived with a really bad man. I know what they look like, how they act, how they make you feel. You're not him." Cash felt something ease in his chest, a knot of guilt and shame that had been wound tight for months starting to loosen. He wasn't innocent. His carelessness had created the opportunity for Marcus's betrayal, but maybe Evie was right. Maybe he wasn't the monster his own guilt had convinced him he was. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been delivering babies in Cedar Creek for 30 years, and she'd seen every kind of situation imaginable. But when Cash Waverly walked into her clinic with a very pregnant young woman, he introduced as a friend staying on my property, Sarah couldn't hide her surprise. "Mr. Waverly," she said carefully, shaking hands with both of them. "It's been a while." Cash had driven Evie to town for her first prenatal appointment in weeks, navigating the whispered stares and pointed looks with the kind of grim determination that suggested he was ready for a fight. Evie had protested that she could take the bus, but Cash had pointed out that her truck was still dead in his driveway and the nearest bus stop was 15 miles away. "Evie needs a doctor," he'd said simply. "Dr. Martinez is the best there is." Now they sat in the small examination room while Dr. Martinez checked Evie's blood pressure and listened to the baby's heartbeat with an ancient stethoscope. The sound filled the room, a rapid, strong rhythm that seemed to echo in Cash's chest like his own pulse. "Everything sounds good," Dr. Martinez said, making notes on Evie's chart. "But I'd like to do an ultrasound just to check the baby's position and make sure everything's developing normally." 20 minutes later, Cash found himself staring at a grainy black-and-white image on a small screen, trying to make sense of the shapes that Dr. Martinez was pointing out with practiced enthusiasm. "There's the head," she said, moving the wand, across Evie's gel-covered belly. "And those are the hands. Looks like the baby's sucking its thumb. Very healthy development for 32 weeks. Cash watched Evie's face as she stared at the screen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her hand gripped his so tightly he thought she might break his fingers, but he didn't mind. There was something miraculous about seeing new life taking shape, about watching a tiny person move and stretch in the safe darkness of its mother's womb. "Would you like to know the sex?" Dr. Martinez asked. Evie looked at Cash, a question in her eyes. They'd talked about this over breakfast, her desire to be surprised versus his practical nature that wanted to plan ahead. In the end, she'd left the decision up to him. "Yes," Cash said quietly. "We'd like to know." Dr. Martinez smiled and moved the wand to get a better angle. "Congratulations, you're having a daughter." A daughter. Cash felt something shift in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. He'd never thought much about children before, never imagined himself as a father figure. But sitting here, watching this little girl move on the screen, he felt an overwhelming surge of protectiveness and love for someone he'd never even met. Elena. Evie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Her name is Elena." Dr. Martinez printed several copies of the ultrasound photo, handing them to Evie with a warm smile. "She looks perfect. Strong heartbeat, good size, moving around like she should be. You're doing everything right." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Martinez pulled Cash aside while Evie was getting dressed. "That young woman has been through something difficult," she said quietly. "I can see it in the way she holds herself, the old injuries that show up on examination. But she's lucky to have found someone like you." "She's the one doing me the favor," Cash replied. "I was half dead before she showed up." Dr. Martinez studied his face with the kind of penetrating look that came from decades of reading people's pain. "You both look better than you did the last time I saw either of you. Maybe you're exactly what each other needed." During the drive home, Evie stared at the ultrasound photo like it contained all the secrets of the universe. "She's real," she said wonderingly. "I mean, I knew she was real, but seeing her like that—" "She's beautiful," Cash said, and meant it. "Just like her mother." Evie looked at him with surprise, and Cash realized what he'd said. The words had slipped out naturally without thought or calculation. Somewhere along the way, he'd started thinking of them as a family. Him, Evie, and the baby they were both already loving. "Cash," Evie said softly, "when you filled out the paperwork today, you put yourself down as the emergency contact. Seemed like the practical thing to do. But it means something. If anything happens to me, if there are decisions to be made about the baby, nothing's going to happen to you," Cash said firmly. "I won't let it." Evie touched the ultrasound photo gently. "You really want us to stay, don't you?" Cash pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine. Through the windshield, he could see his house. No longer empty, no longer echoing with loneliness. Evie's presence had changed everything, filling the silence with purpose and hope. "Yes," he said simply, "I really do." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with the usual pile of legal documents and overdue bills that had become Cash's daily burden. But this envelope was different. No return address, Evie's name written in block letters that looked like they'd been formed by someone trying to disguise their handwriting. Cash found Evie in the kitchen, making coffee and humming softly to herself. She'd been doing that more often lately, humming little Spanish lullabies that her grandmother had sung to her. The sound had become one of his favorite parts of the morning routine. "This came for you," he said, holding out the envelope. The moment Evie saw it, the color drained from her face. Her hand went instinctively to her belly, and Cash watched her careful composure crumble like a house of cards in a strong wind. "You don't have to open it," he said gently. But Evie was already tearing at the envelope with shaking fingers. She read the contents quickly, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Then she sank into a chair and stared at the paper like it contained a death sentence. "What does it say?" Cash asked. Without a word, Evie handed him the letter. The message was short and direct. "I know where you are. You can't hide from me forever. What's mine is mine, and that includes my kid. We need to talk." Cash felt a cold fury settle in his chest. "Who's D?" "Danny Reeves." Evie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Elena's father." Cash crumpled the letter in his fist. "How did he find you?" "I don't know. I've been so careful, paid for everything in cash, didn't use my real name anywhere." Evie's eyes filled with tears. "But Danny's smart and he's connected. He knows people who know people." "Connected how?" Evie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "His family runs drugs through half of South Texas. Not the big operation, but big enough to have money and influence. Big enough to hurt people who get in their way." Cash felt the pieces clicking into place. Why Evie had been so scared. Why she'd been running instead of going to the police. Why she'd been willing to live in her truck rather than ask for help. You couldn't hide from people with that kind of network, and you couldn't fight them through normal channels. Have you ever gone to the police about him? Twice. The first time they said domestic disputes were civil matters. The second time, After he put me in the hospital, they arrested him. He was out on bail in 6 hours, and the charges disappeared a week later." Evie's voice was bitter. "Turns out his uncle plays poker with the sheriff." Cash studied the letter again, noting the postmark from San Antonio, less than 2 hours away. Danny was getting closer, and he was confident enough to announce his intentions. That meant he either had a plan or enough backup to make him feel invulnerable. What does he want? Control. The baby's just an excuse. Evie stood up and began pacing, her hands moving restlessly over her swollen belly. Danny doesn't want to be a father. He wants to own something, to have power over me for the rest of my life. A child gives him that. Cash thought about the ultrasound photo on his refrigerator, about little Elena moving around in the safety of her mother's womb, unaware that there were people in the world who would use her as a weapon. The idea made him sick. "We're not going to let that happen," he said quietly. "We?" Evie stopped pacing and looked at him. "Cash, you don't understand what you're dealing with. These aren't the kind of people who care about property lines or legal documents. They take what they want and they eliminate problems. Then we eliminate them first." The words surprised them both. Cash had never been a violent man, had never even owned a gun beyond the rifles necessary for ranch work. But the thought of Danny Reeves getting his hands on Evie or Elena awakened something primitive and fierce in his chest. "You can't fight people like this," Evie said desperately. "You'll just get yourself killed, and then Elena and I will have nobody." Cash walked to the kitchen window and looked out at his land, the pastures his great-grandfather had claimed, the hills his family had worked for 4 generations. He'd lost almost everything else, but this was still his ground, his responsibility. "To protect, maybe," he said, "but I'll be damned if I'm going to hand you over without a fight." He turned back to Evie, and she saw something in his eyes that made her take a step back. For the first time since she'd known him, Cash Waverly looked dangerous. "We need to call someone," he said. "Someone who knows how to handle situations like this." "Who? I'm not sure yet, but I know one thing. Running didn't work. It's time to make a stand." The shotgun hadn't been fired in 3 years, but Cash cleaned and loaded it with the methodical precision his father had taught him as a boy. The 12-gauge Remington had belonged to his grandfather, who'd used it to protect his cattle from coyotes, and his family from whatever other threats roamed the Texas hill country in harder times. Now it sat loaded by the front door, a silent promise that some lines couldn't be crossed. Cash had spent the morning making phone calls to his lawyer, to the sheriff's department, to anyone who might offer legitimate help against Danny Reeves. The responses had been predictably useless. His lawyer advised him to call the police if anyone actually threatened them. The sheriff's department said they couldn't act on a letter that didn't contain specific threats. Everyone seemed to think that a piece of paper and good intentions would protect a pregnant woman from a man with criminal connections. They didn't understand that people like Danny didn't respect laws or boundaries. They understood only strength and the willingness to use it. Evie found him on the front porch at sunset, sitting in his father's rocking chair with the shotgun across his knees. She lowered herself carefully into the chair beside him, her movements growing more awkward. As Elena grew bigger and stronger inside her, "You look like you're expecting war," she said quietly. "Maybe I am." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of orange and red. In the distance, a hawk circled over the pastures, hunting for unwary prey. Cash found himself thinking about predators and protection, about the ancient rhythms of survival that civilization liked to pretend no longer mattered. "I went into town today," Evie said eventually. "Talked to some people." Cash looked at her sharply. "That wasn't smart. Danny's people could be watching. I was careful, but I needed to know what we're dealing with." Evie pulled a folded newspaper clipping from her pocket. "Found this in the library's computer." The article was from the San Antonio Express-News, dated 6 months earlier. The headline read, "Local man charged in drug distribution ring." Danny Reeves's mugshot stared up at Cash from the page, a lean, hard-looking man with dead eyes and the kind of smile that belonged on a snake. Cash read the article quickly. Danny had been arrested as part of a federal investigation into drug trafficking along the I-35 corridor, but the charges had been dropped when key evidence disappeared, and witnesses suddenly became unwilling to testify. "He's got federal attention," Cash said. "That's good. Means he's on someone's radar. It also means he's desperate. Men like Danny don't handle federal investigations well. They start making mistakes, taking bigger risks." Evie's hand moved protectively over her belly. "That makes him more dangerous, not less." Cash folded the article and handed it back to her. "How long were you with him?" 2 years. Long enough to learn how he thinks, how he operates. Evie's voice was steady, but Cash could see the cost of those memories in her eyes. "He's not stupid, but he's arrogant. He thinks money and fear are the only tools that matter." "What would he do if he couldn't find you?" "Keep looking. Danny doesn't give up and he doesn't forget. This baby represents ownership to him, proof that he can control my life forever." Evie paused, then added quietly, "He'll never stop coming." The simple statement hung in the air between them like a challenge. Cash understood what she was really saying, that running would only delay the inevitable, that Danny would keep hunting until he found them, or until someone made him stop permanently. "Then we end it here," Cash said. "Cash, you don't understand what you're saying. Danny won't come alone, and he won't come unprepared. Neither will we." Cash stood up and extended his hand to help Evie to her feet. "Come on, there's something I need to show you." He led her through the house to his father's study, where he pulled back a heavy rug to reveal a floor safe built into the concrete foundation. The combination was his father's birthday, and the safe opened with a quiet click. Inside were documents, cash, gold coins, and something that made Evie's eyes widen. A collection of handguns and ammunition that suggested the Waverly family had always been prepared for trouble. 4 generations of Texas ranchers, Cash said, lifting out a .45 caliber pistol that had belonged to his grandfather. "We've always known that sometimes the law isn't enough." Evie stared at the weapons with a mixture of fear and relief. "You're really going to fight him?" "We're going to fight him," Cash corrected. "This is our ground now, and he's not welcome on it." For the first time since the letter arrived, Evie smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, but it was determined. "Then we better get ready for war." The marriage license application sat on Cash's kitchen table like a declaration of war. He'd driven to the courthouse in Cedar Creek that morning, walking through the whispered stares and pointed fingers of people who'd once called him friend. The clerk had been professional but cold, processing the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who wanted the transaction to end as quickly as possible. "This is crazy," Evie said for the 3rd time, staring at the official documents. "We barely know each other. We know enough." Cash signed his name with deliberate strokes. "I know you're brave and kind, and you make the best coffee I've ever tasted. I know you're carrying a little girl who's going to need protection and love. I know Danny Reeves will think twice about threatening my wife. That's not how marriage works, Cash. You can't just decide to save someone by signing papers." Cash looked up from the application. "Can't I?" The simple question seemed to catch Evie off guard. She'd been pacing the kitchen for an hour, ever since he'd brought home the paperwork, alternating between practical objections and emotional protests. But underneath all her arguments, Cash could see the longing in her eyes, the desire for safety, for belonging, for someone to choose her and Elena when everyone else had walked away. "I'm not asking you to love me," Cash said gently. "I'm asking you to let me protect you, and maybe, if we're lucky, we'll figure out the rest as we go along." Evie sank into the chair across from him, her hands moving restlessly over her belly. Elena had been active all morning, as if she could sense the tension in her mother's voice and movements. "My grandmother used to say that God sends people into our lives when we need them most," Evie said quietly. "But she also said that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the strangest packages." "Are you calling me strange?" That earned him a small smile. "I'm calling this whole situation strange. A month ago, I was sleeping in my truck and running for my life. Now you're asking me to marry you so you can protect me from my ex-boyfriend. It's not exactly a fairy tale." "Fairy tales are overrated," Cash said. "Real life is messier, but it's also more honest." He reached across the table and took her hands in his. They were small and calloused from hard work, but strong in a way that spoke of survival and determination. "I know this isn't romantic. I know it's not the proposal you dreamed about when you were a little girl. But I also know that marriage isn't about romance. It's about partnership. It's about two people deciding to face the world together instead of alone. And if Danny doesn't back down, if this doesn't work, then at least Elena will have legal protection. If something happens to you, if the worst occurs, she'll be my daughter in the eyes of the law. Danny won't be able to take her." The practical reasoning seemed to resonate with Evie in a way that emotional appeals hadn't. She was a survivor, someone who'd learned to think 3 steps ahead and plan for the worst possible outcomes. "There's something else," Cash continued. "My lawyer called this morning. If I'm married, if I have a family depending on me, it changes how the civil suits get handled, makes it harder for them to take the house, gives us more legal protections." "So, this helps you too?" "It helps both of us. We become stronger together than we were apart." Evie was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the marriage application. Through the kitchen window, they could see the barn where she'd been living, the apartment that had become a temporary sanctuary in her long journey to nowhere. "I don't have a wedding dress," she said finally. "We don't need one. Judge Martinez said he'd perform the ceremony in his chambers tomorrow afternoon. Just us, him, and the clerk, as a witness. No flowers, no music, no family. No." Cash agreed. "But also no lies, no false promises, no pretending this is something it's not." Evie picked up the pen and stared at the signature line that would make her Mrs. Evelyn Waverly. "You sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She signed her name with quick, decisive strokes, then looked up at him, with eyes that held equal parts hope and terror. "Well, Mr. Waverly," she said, "I guess we're getting married." Cash felt something settle in his chest, a rightness that he hadn't experienced since before his world fell apart. "Yes, ma'am, I guess we are." Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, but for the first time in months, Cash wasn't worried about the weather. The private investigator's file landed on Cash's kitchen table with the weight of a bombshell. Frank Morrison had been his father's friend, a former Texas Ranger who'd gone into private security after retiring from law enforcement. Cash had called him the day after the marriage ceremony, asking for a background check on Danny Reeves that went deeper than newspaper articles. What Frank had found changed everything. "You're not going to like this," Frank said, settling his weathered frame into a kitchen chair. He was 65 years old, built like a tree stump, and had the kind of eyes that had seen too much of the wrong side of human nature. Cash and Evie sat across from him, her hand resting on the manila folder like she was afraid to open it. They'd been married for 3 days now, a quiet ceremony in Judge Martinez's chambers that had felt more like a business transaction than a wedding. But the simple gold band on Evie's finger had seemed to give her strength, a visible reminder that she wasn't facing the world alone anymore. "Just tell us," Cash said. Frank opened the file and spread several documents across the table. Police reports, court records, FBI surveillance photos, and something that made Cash's blood run cold, a DNA test result with Elena's name on it. "Danny Reeves has been busy," Frank began. "After you disappeared, Evie, he hired his own private investigator, good one too, former DEA agent with connections throughout law enforcement. They've been tracking you for months." "How?" Evie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Hospital records from when he put you in the emergency room. You used your real Social Security number for the billing, which gave them a paper trail. They followed it through 3 states, checking every clinic, every women's shelter, Every place a pregnant woman might seek help. Frank pulled out a map marked with red pins. They know about the truck breakdown, know about your stay here, know about the marriage. Danny's been watching this property for a week. Cash felt his jaw clench. Where? Hunting blind about 2 miles north, up on the ridge that overlooks your house. Good position. He can see everything coming and going. Frank tapped another document. But that's not the worst part. He slid the DNA test results across the table. Danny filed a paternity claim in family court 3 days ago. Claims he has legal rights to the child as the biological father. Evie's face went white. How did he get my DNA? Doesn't need yours? He used his own and claimed the child was conceived during your relationship. Without a competing paternity claim, the court has to assume he's telling the truth. But I'm married now, Evie protested. Cash is Elena's legal father. Frank shook his head grimly. Not in Texas. Biological fathers have rights that supersede marriage in custody cases. Danny's playing this smart. He's not trying to kidnap the baby. He's trying to win her legally. Cash studied the court documents with growing anger. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Emergency custody hearing is scheduled for next week. If Danny shows up with a lawyer and you don't, he could walk out with temporary custody pending a full investigation. That's insane. He's a drug dealer with a criminal record. A drug dealer who's never been convicted of anything, Frank corrected. His lawyer is already arguing that his arrest was politically motivated, that he's a legitimate businessman being persecuted by overzealous federal agents. Evie stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her arms wrapped around her swollen belly. Cash could see her shoulders shaking, could hear the rapid breathing that meant she was fighting panic. There's more, Frank continued. I did some digging into your situation too, Cash. Found some interesting connections. He pulled out another set of documents. Marcus Delacroix, your former business partner. Turns out he's been laundering money for the Reeves family operation for the past 2 years. Danny's uncle, Carlos Reeves, owns several shell companies that Marcus used to hide stolen funds from your ranch. Cash stared at the financial records, seeing his own forged signature on documents he'd never seen before. They're connected. More than connected. Marcus disappearing into witness protection. That was to keep him safe from the Reeves family, not from you. Turns out he'd been skimming from their operations too. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about an abusive ex-boyfriend trying to claim his child. This was about a criminal organization that had been systematically destroying Cash's life for years, using Marcus as their inside man. Why? Cash asked. What did they want with my ranch? Frank smiled grimly. Location, location, location. Your property sits on a major smuggling route between San Antonio and Austin. Remote, private, with good road access and minimal law enforcement presence. Perfect for moving drugs and money. So they destroyed my reputation, killed my ranch hands, and now they're using Evie to get access to my land. That's about the size of it. Evie turned from the window, tears streaming down her face, but fury blazing in her eyes. They used me. Danny didn't want me back because he loved me or even because he wanted to control me. I was just a way to get to Cash's property. Looks that way, Frank confirmed. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Cash stood up and walked to his gun safe, pulling out the .45 that had belonged to his grandfather. We're going to end this. Cash, no, Evie said quickly. If you hurt Danny, you'll just prove everything they've said about you. Then we do this legally, Cash said, checking the pistol's action. But we do it prepared for the possibility that they won't. Frank Morrison's second file was thicker than the first, and when he opened it, Cash understood why the old ranger had looked so grim during their phone conversation. The photographs spilled across the kitchen table like evidence from a crime scene, surveillance photos, bank records, and communication intercepts that painted a picture of corruption reaching deeper than Cash had ever imagined. I've been working this case for 72 hours straight, Frank said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Called in every favor I had with law enforcement, pulled strings I haven't pulled in 20 years. What I found is going to change everything. The first photograph showed Marcus Delacroix shaking hands with a man Cash didn't recognize outside a bank in Houston. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 weeks before the ranch accident that killed Billy Rodriguez and Tom Whitaker. "That's FBI agent David Chen," Frank explained. "He's been running an undercover operation against the Reeves family for 18 months. Marcus isn't in witness protection. He's been a federal informant from the beginning." Evie leaned forward, studying the photos. "What does that mean?" "It means everything that happened to Cash was part of a federal sting operation. They needed someone with legitimate business connections to help them trace the Reeves family's money laundering network. Cash's ranch was perfect, remote, successful, with enough financial complexity to hide their activities." Cash felt the room spinning around him. "They destroyed my life for a federal investigation, not intentionally. The plan was to use Marcus to gather evidence, then expose the whole operation without involving you directly. But the Reeves family got suspicious and started putting pressure on Marcus. He panicked and decided to disappear, but he needed a scapegoat to explain why the books didn't balance." Frank pulled out a thick stack of bank records. Every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every suspicious transfer, Marcus documented all of it for the FBI. He just forgot to mention that he was setting you up to take the fall. "The ranch accident?" Cash asked, his voice tight, with controlled rage. "Genuine accident, but Marcus saw an opportunity. He'd been delaying maintenance to create financial records that would support the fraud narrative. When the brakes failed and those men died, he used it to complete your destruction." Evie's hand found Cash's across the table. "Where is Marcus now?" Frank smiled grimly. "That's the interesting part. He's not in witness protection. He's in federal custody. Has been for 6 months. Turns out he was skimming from both the Reeves family and the FBI operation. Agent Chen arrested him when they discovered he was planning to disappear with about $12 million in stolen money. $12 million that came from my accounts," Cash said. "Most of it, yes. But here's the good news. The FBI has been tracking every penny. They can prove where the money came from, where it went, and who authorized every transfer. Marcus kept detailed records because he thought it would protect him if things went wrong." Frank opened another file folder, this one containing legal documents. "Agent Chen is prepared to testify on your behalf. The FBI wants to make this right, partly because they feel responsible for what happened to you, and partly because they need your cooperation to finish their case against the Reeves family." "What kind of cooperation?" Cash asked suspiciously. "They want to use your property for the final phase of their operation. Danny's custody claim isn't just about Elena. It's about getting legal access to your ranch so they can establish their smuggling route. The FBI wants to let him think he's succeeding, then catch him and his entire organization in one coordinated takedown." Evie shook her head. "You're asking us to use Elena as bait." "I'm asking you to help us end this once and for all," Frank replied. "The FBI has enough evidence to arrest Danny on the drug charges, but they want the whole network. If they can catch them trying to use your property for smuggling, they can file federal conspiracy charges that will put the entire family away for decades." Cash studied the photographs and documents spread across his table. Months of isolation and guilt. Months of believing he was responsible for the deaths of good men. Months of watching his life crumble because of his own carelessness. All of it orchestrated by people who saw him as nothing more than a useful target. "What guarantees do we have?" he asked finally. "Federal marshals will be stationed on your property. Elena will never be in real danger. And when it's over, you'll have enough evidence to clear your name completely and recover your stolen assets. The civil suits will disappear when the families realize you were as much a victim as they were. Marcus, the FBI, and the Justice Department will all testify that you had no knowledge of the fraud." Cash looked at Evie, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. They could keep running, keep hiding, keep looking over their shoulders for the rest of their lives, or they could make a stand here, on this land that had been in his family. For 4 generations, and end the nightmare once and for all. How long? He asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. They're already moving money through the area, testing routes and security. Danny's custody hearing is just the legal cover they need to establish a permanent presence on your property. And if something goes wrong, Frank met his eyes steadily, then Elena grows up knowing her parents died, fighting for her freedom instead of running from it. The federal agents arrived at dawn, their black SUVs winding up Cash's private road, like a funeral procession. Agent David Chen looked younger than Cash had expected for someone running a multi-year undercover operation. Maybe 40, with the kind of steady eyes that suggested he'd seen enough corruption to last several lifetimes. "Mr. Waverly, Mrs. Waverly," he said, shaking hands with both of them on the front porch. "Thank you for agreeing to cooperate with our investigation." Cash noted the way Agent Chen addressed Evie as Mrs. Waverly, with complete sincerity, as if their 3-day-old marriage was as legitimate as any other. It was a small gesture, but it told Cash that the FBI understood the stakes involved. "Let's be clear about something," Cash said as they walked through his house. "This isn't about cooperation. This is about survival. If you can clear my name and protect my family in the process, that's fine. But Elena's safety comes first." Understood completely, Agent Chen pulled out a tablet and began showing them detailed floor plans of the house and surrounding property. "We've been surveilling your ranch for the past week, mapping sightlines and access points. Danny's people have been watching too, which is why we need to be very careful about how we proceed." The legal documents Agent Chen produced were thick and complex, but the essence was simple enough. Cash would continue to live normally on his property while federal marshals established hidden positions throughout the ranch. When Danny made his move, either through the court system or through direct action, they'd be ready. "The custody hearing is scheduled for Monday," Agent Chen explained. "Our intelligence suggests Danny plans to use it as a distraction while his people establish a permanent presence on your land. Once the judge grants him visitation rights, he'll have legal justification for being here regularly." Evie shifted uncomfortably in her chair, one hand on her belly where Elena had been unusually active all morning. What if the judge decides in his favor? What if he actually gets custody? "That won't happen," Agent Chen said confidently. "We have a federal prosecutor prepared to intervene with evidence of Danny's criminal activities, but we need him to make the first move, to show clear intent to use your property for illegal purposes." "You're asking us to trust a system that's already failed us once," Cash pointed out. "Fair enough. But this time you have federal backing, documented evidence, and a team of marshals who've been tracking the Reeves family for 2 years. This isn't local politics or small-town corruption. This is federal law enforcement with unlimited resources." Agent Chen introduced them to Marshal Sarah Williams, a compact woman in her 30s who carried herself like a professional soldier. She'd be living in the barn apartment next to Evie's old room, posing as a ranch hand Cash had hired to help with security during his legal troubles. "My job is to make sure nothing happens to your family," Marshal Williams said simply. "I've been doing protective detail for 8 years, and I've never lost a principle." The next few hours were spent installing hidden cameras and communication equipment throughout the property. Agent Chen's team worked with military precision, hiding surveillance devices in fence posts, barn rafters, and even the old oak tree by the creek. By evening, every approach to the house was monitored, and Cash had a panic button that would bring federal backup within minutes. "This feels like we're preparing for a siege," Evie said, as they watched the agents test their equipment. "In a way, we are," Cash replied, "but this time we're not facing it alone." That night, as they lay in the master bedroom that had become their shared space by necessity rather than romance, Evie turned to face him in the darkness. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. "Terrified," Cash admitted, "but not of Danny or his family. I'm scared of losing what we've built here, scared of something happening to Elena before she even has a chance to be born." Something's happening between us, isn't it? Evie's voice was soft, uncertain. This isn't just about protection anymore. Cash considered the question carefully. Somewhere between shared breakfasts and evening conversations, between her quiet strength and his growing protectiveness, something had indeed changed. He found himself looking forward to her company, listening for her humming in the mornings, checking on her throughout the day, not out of duty, but out of genuine care. "Yes," he said simply, "something's happening. I need you to know," Evie continued, "that whatever happens on Monday, whatever the judge decides, or what Danny tries to do, I'm grateful for what you've given me. For the first time in my life, I feel like someone chose me, chose to protect me, chose to fight for me." Cash reached for her hand in the darkness, finding her fingers warm and steady. "You chose me too. You could have kept running, could have declined my offer and disappeared again. But you stayed. You trusted me with Elena's future. I trusted you with more than that," Evie whispered. Before Cash could ask what she meant, she moved closer in the bed, her hand finding his face in the darkness. When she kissed him, it wasn't desperate or passionate, but gentle and sure, like a promise being made without words. When they broke apart, Cash felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with federal investigations or criminal conspiracies. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever dangers they faced, they would face them as a real family. Not just a marriage of convenience, but two people who had chosen each other in the midst of chaos. "I love you," Evie said quietly. "I love you too," Cash replied, surprised by how naturally the words came. Outside, federal agents maintained their vigilant watch, preparing for a battle that would determine not just their safety, but the future of 4 generations of Waverly legacy. But inside the old house, two people who had found each other in the darkness were finally ready to fight for something worth keeping. The Brazos County Courthouse had been built in 1889. Its limestone walls and soaring clock tower designed to inspire respect for law and order. Cash had walked through these halls countless times over the years, for property disputes, business licenses, even his marriage ceremony just days earlier. But he'd never felt the weight of justice pressing down on him quite like this. Judge Patricia Whitmore was a stern woman in her 60s who'd been presiding over family court for 20 years. She had a reputation for no-nonsense decisions and a particular intolerance for parents who used children as weapons in their personal battles. Cash hoped that reputation would work in their favor today. Danny Reeves sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a sharp-dressed man from San Antonio who probably cost more per hour than most people made in a week. Danny himself looked different than his mugshot. Cleaner, wearing an expensive suit that made him appear more like a successful businessman than a drug dealer. But Cash could see the predator underneath the polish, the cold calculation in the way Danny's eyes moved over Evie, like she was property he intended to reclaim. "Your Honor," Danny's lawyer began, "my client is here today seeking nothing more than his fundamental right to be a father to his unborn child. Ms. Morales, Mrs. Waverly, has denied him any contact or involvement in the pregnancy, despite his repeated attempts to provide support and be present for important medical appointments." Cash felt his jaw clench. The lie was smooth and practiced, delivered with the kind of confidence that came from expensive legal coaching. Evie's own lawyer, a young woman named Rebecca Santos, who specialized in domestic violence cases, stood to respond. "Your Honor, my client has documented evidence of Mr. Reeves's history of physical and emotional abuse. She left that relationship to protect herself and her unborn child, and has every right to maintain that protection. Nevertheless, Danny's..." Lawyer interrupted. "Paternity tests confirm that Mr. Reeves is the biological father. Under Texas law, biological fathers have inherent rights that cannot be terminated without due process." Judge Whitmore studied the documents in front of her with the careful attention of someone who'd seen every kind of custody manipulation imaginable. "Mr. Reeves," You're claiming that Mrs. Waverly denied you access to the child and fled the state to prevent you from exercising your parental rights. Yes, Your Honor, Danny said, his voice carrying just the right note of wounded sincerity. I've been trying to find her for months, not to cause trouble, but to be present for my child's birth and to provide financial support. Cash watched Evie's face as Danny spoke, seeing the way she flinched at his lies. This was why she'd been running, why she'd been terrified to stop anywhere long enough to seek proper help. Danny was smart enough to manipulate the system, to present himself as the wronged party, while painting Evie as an unstable woman who'd kidnapped his child. That's when Agent Chen stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, I'm FBI Agent David Chen. I have evidence directly relevant to this case that the court needs to hear. Judge Whitmore looked surprised, but intrigued. Agent Chen, this is a family court proceeding, unless you have evidence of federal crimes. I do, Your Honor. Mr. Reeves is currently under federal investigation for drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy. His claim for custody rights is part of a larger criminal enterprise designed to gain access to Mrs. Waverly's current residence for illegal purposes. Danny's lawyer was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. These are unsubstantiated allegations designed to prejudice the court against my client. Agent Chen pulled out a thick folder. Your Honor, I have surveillance photos, recorded conversations, and documented evidence of Mr. Reeves's criminal activities spanning the past 18 months. I also have testimony from a federal informant who can verify that Mr. Reeves has explicitly stated his intention to use any court-ordered custody arrangements to establish a criminal operation on the Waverly Ranch. The courtroom erupted. Danny's lawyer demanded to see the evidence. Rebecca Santos requested an immediate recess to review the federal materials. Judge Whitmore banged her gavel for order. But Cash was watching Danny, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The mask of civilized businessman had slipped, revealing the dangerous predator underneath. Danny's eyes were fixed on Evie with naked rage, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Your Honor, Agent Chen continued, the FBI is prepared to arrest Mr. Reeves on federal charges today, if necessary. We've been building this case for 2 years, and we have more than enough evidence to proceed. Judge Whitmore studied the federal agent carefully. Agent Chen, are you telling this court that Mr. Reeves represents a clear and present danger to Mrs. Waverly and her unborn child? Yes, Your Honor. An immediate and credible threat. That's when Danny made his move. He stood up suddenly, pushing past his lawyer toward Evie's table. Cash was moving before he'd consciously decided to act, intercepting Danny 3 steps from his wife. The 2 men crashed together in front of the judge's bench, Danny's momentum carrying them both to the floor. You think you can steal what's mine? Danny snarled, his hands reaching for Cash's throat. You think some piece of paper makes her yours? Cash rolled, using his larger size and ranch-hardened strength to pin Danny against the courtroom floor. Around them, bailiffs were shouting. Agent Chen was calling for backup, and Judge Whitmore was demanding order. But all Cash could hear was Danny's voice, low and vicious in his ear. I'll kill you both before I let you keep what belongs to me. The words were barely a whisper, meant only for Cash to hear, but they were also a confession, and the courtroom's recording system captured every syllable. When the bailiffs finally separated them, Danny was in handcuffs and Agent Chen was reading him his federal rights. The custody hearing was over before it had really begun, ended by Danny's own inability to control his rage when his carefully constructed lies fell apart. Judge Whitmore's gavel came down like thunder. Mr. Reeves, you are hereby denied all custody, claims, and barred from any contact with Mrs. Waverly or her child. This court finds that you represent a clear danger to both mother and child. She turned to Agent Chen. Agent, I assume you'll be taking Mr. Reeves into federal custody. Yes, Your Honor. We have warrants ready. As federal agents led Danny away, he looked back at Evie one last time. But the predatory confidence was gone, replaced by the desperate fury of a man who'd finally been cornered. "This isn't over," he called out as the courtroom doors closed behind him. But Cash knew it was. The gavel had fallen, justice had spoken, and his family was finally safe. Elena Rose Waverly arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 weeks after the courthouse confrontation that had ended Danny Reeves's threat forever. She came into the world with her mother's dark hair, and what the doctors claimed was her father's stubborn chin, though Cash suspected that particular trait came from both sides of her new family. Dr. Martinez had delivered the baby at Cedar Creek General Hospital, the same place where Cash had been born 47 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. His life had come full circle in that sterile delivery room, watching Evie bring new life into a world that had seemed impossibly dark just months before. "She's perfect," Evie whispered, cradling Elena against her chest while Cash sat beside the hospital bed, still amazed by the tiny miracle they'd created together. Not through biology, but through choice, through love, through the decision to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pasts. The first photograph showed all three of them. Cash's weathered hand supporting Elena's impossibly small head, while Evie smiled with the exhausted joy of new motherhood. It would replace the empty picture frame on his side table, filling that space with hope instead of regret. Cash had been cleared of all charges 3 days after Danny's arrest. The federal prosecutors had moved quickly once they had Danny and his uncle Carlos in custody, offering reduced sentences in exchange for testimony that confirmed Marcus Delacroix's role in the money laundering operation. The ranch accident investigation was reopened with new evidence, officially clearing Cash of any negligence in the deaths of Billy Rodriguez and Tom Whitaker. The civil lawsuits had been dropped when the families learned the truth about Marcus's manipulation. Sarah Whitaker had even called to apologize, her voice thick with tears as she explained how the grief had made her blame the wrong man. Billy Rodriguez's widow had done the same, adding that she hoped Cash could forgive her anger. Forgiveness had come easier than Cash had expected. The anger that had consumed him for months had simply evaporated when he held Elena for the first time, replaced by a fierce protectiveness and a gratitude so profound it made his chest ache. The ranch was alive again. Miguel Santos had returned as foreman, bringing with him 3 of the old hands who'd found work elsewhere during Cash's troubles. The cattle were back in the pastures, the oil wells were pumping again, and the house echoed with sounds that had nothing to do with loneliness. Evie had transformed the smallest bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow that matched the baby blanket she'd finished knitting the week before Elena's birth. Cash's grandfather's pocket watch sat on the dresser now, no longer marking time toward nothing, but counting the precious hours of Elena's new life. On quiet evenings, when Elena was sleeping and the house was peaceful, Cash and Evie would sit on the front porch where they'd first learned to trust each other. Sometimes they talked about the future, about expanding the ranch, about giving Elena brothers and sisters, about the legacy they wanted to build together. Sometimes they just held hands and watched the sunset paint the Texas hills gold and red. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Evie asked one evening, Elena sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Every day," Cash replied, "but I don't regret any of it. Not the betrayal, not the lawsuits, not even the loneliness, because it all led to you, to her, to this." Evie looked down at their daughter, who had opened her eyes and was staring up at them with the serious expression that Cash was learning meant she was thinking deep baby thoughts. "I love you, Cash Waverly," Evie said simply. "I love you too, Mrs. Waverly, both of you." The grandfather clock chimed the hour from inside the house, but Cash no longer counted time as something slipping away. Instead, he counted it as something gained. Every minute with his wife and daughter, a gift he'd never expected to receive. In the distance, oil pumps rhythmically pulled black gold from Waverly land, just as they had for 4 generations. But now, They were pulling up something more valuable than money. They were pulling up hope, love, and the promise of a future worth fighting for. Elena Rose Waverly would grow up knowing she was chosen, wanted, and fiercely protected by a man who'd learned that sometimes the greatest treasures came wrapped in the most unexpected packages. And Cash Waverly, the man who'd lost everything, had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. A family worth keeping, a love worth fighting for, and a legacy that would last long after the oil wells ran dry.